Eleanor did not cry at her wedding. She had decided that much before the carriage even reached the iron gates of Ashvale Manor. She had decided it the way a person decides to survive something, not with joy, not with hope, but with the quiet, firm determination of someone who has no other choice. She kept her chin up as the doors opened. She kept her hands steady as she stepped onto the stone steps. She kept her eyes forward as the great house swallowed her whole. Ashvale Manor was enormous. It rose from the Yorkshire moorland like something that had always been there, something older than the families who had lived inside it. The stone was grey and heavy, darkened in places by decades of English rain. The windows were tall and narrow, and the light behind them was thin, barely suggesting warmth. There were no flowers at the entrance. No ribbons. No small touches that might have told Eleanor she was expected with gladness. There was only stone, and cold air, and the sound of her own shoes on the steps. She had been told he was private. She had been told he kept to himself. She had been told that Duke Edmund Voss was a man of habits and discipline and that he did not entertain often, did not laugh often, and did not speak more than was necessary. Her mother had said all of this with a shrug, as if it were a small inconvenience, the way one might describe a house with a drafty corridor or a garden that needed weeding. She had not said, "He will look through you." She had not said, "He will stand beside you at the altar and you will not feel his presence at all, even though he is close enough to touch." Edmund Voss was 34 years old. He was tall, lean, and dressed in black, which seemed less like a fashion choice and more like a personal philosophy. His hair was dark. His jaw was set. He had cheekbones that might have made him look handsome in a painting, and they did make him look handsome, but the rest of him, the stillness, the flat quality of his gaze, the way he held himself like a man braced for something unpleasant, undid whatever the cheekbones tried to offer. He stood at the altar of the small estate chapel and watched her walk toward him with an expression that revealed nothing. Not relief. Not pleasure. Not even the polite warmth that strangers at a dinner party might manage. He said his vows clearly and correctly. He signed the register in a firm hand. He did not smile at her, but he did nod, once, briefly, when she met his eyes after the papers were witnessed. It was the nod of a man who had completed a task. Eleanor accepted it because she had no option, and because she had promised herself she would not cry. The wedding supper was prepared by the staff with evident care, though Edmund ate very little of it. He sat at the head of the long dining table, and Eleanor sat near him, and the distance between them felt much greater than the few feet of polished wood that separated their plates. The two elderly housemaids and the butler moved quietly around the room, and nobody spoke much. Edmund asked Eleanor once whether the soup was to her liking. She said it was very good. He nodded and returned to his meal. When the supper was cleared, he stood, thanked her for the evening in a tone that belonged to a business letter, and told her that her rooms were in the east wing and that his housekeeper, a stout, soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Hadley, would show her the way. Then he walked out of the dining room. Eleanor sat very still for a moment after he left. She listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She placed her hands flat on the table and breathed steadily. She did not cry. Mrs. Hadley was kind in the quiet, careful way of someone who had worked in difficult houses for a long time and had learned which kindnesses were safe to offer. She showed Eleanor her rooms without commentary. The bedroom was large and well appointed, with heavy curtains and a fireplace already lit. The fire was the warmest thing Eleanor had encountered since arriving. She stood in front of it for several minutes after Mrs. Hadley left, still in her wedding clothes, letting the heat reach her hands. She did not see Edmund again that night. The days that followed moved in a pattern that quickly became familiar. Edmund rose early and was in his study by the time Eleanor came downstairs for breakfast. A place was always set for her at the dining table, and food was always ready, and the morning paper was always folded neatly at her spot, but Edmund himself was usually absent. On the days when he was present at breakfast, he read his correspondence and responded to her comments about the weather, about the grounds she had begun to explore, about the books she was finding in the library, with brief, accurate answers that closed each subject before it could become a conversation. He was never rude. That was perhaps the most disorienting thing about it. He never spoke sharply or dismissed her with contempt. He was simply not there, not fully, even when he was physically in the room. He was like a man standing behind glass, visible, but untouchable, and entirely unreachable. Eleanor was not a weak woman. She had not come from an easy household. Her father had been a decent man but a poor one, and after he died, her mother had made it plainly clear that Eleanor's marriage was the family's best remaining resource. Eleanor had understood this without bitterness, mostly because bitterness required energy she could not afford. She had agreed to the arrangement with Lord Voss's family because the alternative was watching her younger sister go without schooling and her mother sell the last of the furniture. She had not expected love. She had not even particularly expected comfort. But she had expected, in some small, private part of herself, to be acknowledged. She began to walk the estate grounds every morning, partly because the Yorkshire moorland was genuinely beautiful in the early light, and partly because moving made the stillness of the house easier to bear. She walked far, sometimes, out past the formal gardens and down toward the low fields where the heather grew thick and the wind came off the hills without interruption. She wore sturdy boots and a heavy coat, and she let the cold air fill her lungs, and she did not think about the dining room or the empty corridor outside her bedroom door or the fact that 2 weeks into her marriage she had still not had a real conversation with her husband. On one of those mornings, she found the grave. It was not hidden, exactly. It sat inside a low stone wall at the edge of the private garden, set apart from the small family plot where previous dukes and their wives were buried. A single stone marker, simple and plain, with a name carved into it, Maris Collier. Beneath the name were 2 dates: she had been 22 years old when she died. And at the base of the stone, placed so recently that the dew had not yet dried on the petals, was a small bunch of wild heather. Eleanor stood very still and looked at the flowers for a long time. She did not ask Edmund about it. She knew, even then, that asking Edmund directly about anything personal was like trying to open a door that had been not just closed but bricked over. She filed the name away carefully and said nothing. A week later, she tried something small. She had found a book in the library that she thought he might find interesting, a volume of natural history with careful illustrations of the moorland plants and birds local to Yorkshire. She left it on the corner of the dining table where he sat in the mornings, with a small paper tucked inside. "I thought you might like this." She signed it simply with her initial. The next morning, the book was gone from the table. There was no note. No comment at breakfast. She watched his face carefully over her teacup and found nothing, not dismissal, not gratitude, just the same composed blankness she was learning to read the way sailors read the sky, not for beauty, but for information. That evening, passing the study, she noticed that the door was open a crack. She did not slow her walk or look in. But in the brief moment the gap allowed, she saw him at his desk, the book open in front of him, his head bent over one of the illustrations. It was so small a thing. A man reading a book she had given him. But Eleanor felt something move in her chest that she could not quite name, something that was not quite hope but was adjacent to it, and she carried it carefully for the rest of the evening like something that might break if she held it too tightly. She went to bed that night and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The house settled around her, groaning in that old way of stone houses on windy nights. Somewhere, far down the corridor, a door clicked shut. She imagined Edmund at his desk, still reading. She imagined him turning a page. She imagined him, just for one small and private moment, choosing not to be alone. Then the wind picked up, and the house went quiet again, and she pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. She still did not cry. But it was getting harder. Edmund Voss had not wanted to get married again. He had made this clear to his solicitor, to his cousin Geoffrey who managed the estate's legal affairs, and to himself, on several separate occasions, with varying degrees of calm. He was orderly in his thinking, methodical in his habits, and deeply aware that the estate required a legitimate heir and that his own continued resistance to the subject was, in purely practical terms, unsustainable. He had therefore agreed. He had agreed the way a man agrees to have a tooth pulled, not gladly, but with the grim recognition that refusing it longer would only make things worse. He had not expected Eleanor. He was not sure, even now, what he had expected. Someone manageable, perhaps. Someone who would understand the nature of the arrangement and settle into the East Wing and organize the household accounts and cause him no particular disturbance. He had not expected a woman who walked the moors alone at 7 in the morning with her coat buttoned to her chin and came home with mud on her boots and color in her cheeks. He had not expected her to leave a book on his table with a note that said simply, "I thought you might like this," with such quiet confidence that there was no performance in it, no bid for his attention, just a plain and generous observation. He had read the book. He had read it until the fire burned low, because the illustrations were excellent and the text was precise in a way he admired. He had not thanked her because he had not known how to do it without opening a door he was not prepared to open. This was the thing about Edmund Voss that very few people understood. He was not cold because he did not feel. He was cold because he felt too much and had discovered, at considerable personal cost, what happened when he allowed that. Maris Collier had been 22 years old when she fell from her horse on a morning ride across the North Field. Edmund had been 27. They had been engaged for 4 months, and he had loved her with the full, uncomplicated force of a man who had not yet learned to be careful with that particular feeling. He had been there when it happened. He had been there for the whole of it, the fall, the terrible stillness afterward, the long hours that followed at her bedside while the doctor did what he could and then, quietly, told them that there was nothing more to be done. Edmund had held her hand. He had spoken to her. He did not know, and never would know, whether she heard any of it. He had buried her at the edge of the private garden because she had loved that garden. He had placed heather on her grave every week since because she had loved heather. He had locked the portrait of her in the east corridor not because he wanted to forget her but because he could not bear to see her face every morning and then go about his day as if that were an ordinary thing to carry. And then, 7 years later, he had agreed to marry Eleanor Holt, and she had arrived at his house, and she had not cried at their wedding, and he had noticed that particularly, the way her chin was set, the way her hands were steady, the careful, contained dignity of a woman who was bearing something she had not chosen. He recognized it. He recognized it in the specific way that one recognizes something in another person that you have long practiced in yourself. This made Eleanor considerably more dangerous than he had anticipated. He kept his distance deliberately. He was not cruel about it. He made sure she was comfortable, that her rooms were warm, that Mrs. Hadley attended to anything she needed, that her allowance was more than adequate. He left the morning paper at her place because he had noticed on the 3rd morning that she reached for it automatically, and he saw no reason to withhold something so small. He answered her comments at breakfast because ignoring her entirely would have been unkind, and Edmund was not, whatever else he was, an unkind man. But he did not let her close. He did not let her through the glass. Then she found the grave. He knew the morning it happened. He had been returning from the stables and had come around the side of the private garden wall and had seen her there, standing very still, looking at the stone marker. She did not see him. She did not know he was there. He stood at the edge of the wall and watched her look at the heather for a long moment, her face turned away from him so he could not read it. Then she pulled her coat closer against the wind and walked back toward the house. She said nothing about it. Not that day, not the following week. She did not ask who Maris was. She did not bring it up at breakfast with some carefully worded question designed to pry open his history. She simply carried the knowledge, whatever she had made of it, without using it. He did not know what to do with a woman who found the most painful thing in his life and then quietly left it alone. The weeks continued. The household ran smoothly. Eleanor organized several things without being asked, had the east parlor windows repaired because the draft was significant, arranged for a local woman to come and help with the mending, wrote careful and prompt letters to the tenants who had sent correspondence that had been sitting unanswered in the study for weeks. He found the replies on his desk one morning, neatly stacked, already sealed and waiting for his signature. He read through them. They were accurate, considerate, and well written. He signed them all. He did not thank her for that either. He told himself it was not necessary. He told himself that she understood the nature of their arrangement, that gratitude implied a closeness that would be misleading to offer. He told himself these things with the precision of a man who had learned to be very good at telling himself things. The cracks appeared anyway. The first one was on a Tuesday in late October. Eleanor had come into the library to return a book, not knowing he was there, and had stopped when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them moved. She had been outside recently, her cheeks were still faintly pink from the cold, and there was a small leaf caught in her hair just above her ear, a dry gold one that had blown in from the garden, and she was entirely unaware of it. Edmund looked at it. He did not reach out and remove it. But he almost did. The impulse moved through him before he could stop it, and the fact that it had moved through him at all was enough to alarm him considerably. He nodded at her. He said good afternoon. He took his book and left the library. In his study, he sat for a long time without reading anything. The second crack was smaller, and therefore more alarming. He had woken in the night from a dream, not a nightmarish one, not one of the dark and suffocating ones that had plagued him for years after Maris died, but a quiet one, almost pleasant. He had dreamed of walking across the lower fields in early morning, and in the dream Eleanor had been beside him, and they had been talking about something, he could not remember what, and it had felt entirely natural. He woke from it with the dream's warmth still in his chest and felt immediately, sharply uncomfortable. He got up and went to his study and read until the feeling passed. He was very good at making feelings pass. But there was a third crack, and it was the one he could not manage. It began simply enough. He had risen early, as he always did, and had noticed, something he had begun, without meaning to notice more often, that Eleanor's bedroom door was closed and that no light came from beneath it. She was still asleep. He went downstairs. He went to his study. He worked through his correspondence until mid-morning, and then he stopped and realized that the house was still very quiet, in a way it was not usually quiet by that hour. He went to find Mrs. Hadley. Had she seen Eleanor this morning? Mrs. Hadley had not. Had she come down for breakfast? She had not. Was she perhaps unwell? Mrs. Hadley looked at him for a moment, that careful, neutral look of a woman who has worked in houses long enough to understand their occupants without commenting on them, and said that perhaps he might check himself. He went to the east wing. He knocked at Eleanor's door. There was no answer. He opened it carefully, expecting to find her asleep, or perhaps sitting by the window in a blanket. The room was empty. The bed had been made, she made her own bed, he had learned, despite the housemaid's protests, and the room was cold. The fire had not been lit, which meant she had been up and gone before the morning staff arrived. He felt a sudden, specific unease that he recognized as something close to fear, which irritated him. He put on his coat. He went outside. He checked the garden first. Then the stables, where the groom said she had not come. He walked the path along the low field, the one she took most mornings, but the moorland was empty, gray and wide in the November light. He stood for a moment at the top of the ridge and looked out across the estate, and then he turned back toward the house, and that was when he saw the light. It was coming from the small estate chapel, set at the far end of the private garden, behind the family plot. A thin, warm, amber light through the narrow windows. Small and steady in the pale morning gray. Edmund walked toward it. His boots were loud on the frozen path. He pushed open the chapel door and stepped inside. She was there. She was not at the pews. She was on the floor, the cold stone floor in front of the altar, kneeling with her forehead nearly against her hands, her coat still on, her whole body tight with the effort of something she was doing very quietly but could not entirely contain. Her shoulders were moving. Small, controlled movements, the movements of someone who had learned to cry without sound, without display, without asking anything of anyone. The movements of someone who had been doing it alone for a long time. Edmund stood in the doorway. He had not expected this. He was not sure what he had expected, he had not let himself form an expectation, he had simply walked toward the light, but not this. Not her, like this, on a cold stone floor, crying without a sound, in the early morning, alone. Something broke open in Edmund Voss's chest. It was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet, the way the most significant things are often quiet. It was the sound of a door giving way that had been held shut for 7 years. He did not leave. He did not turn around and go back to his study and return to his correspondence and let the feeling pass the way he had learned to let feelings pass. He walked into the chapel. His footsteps echoed on the stone. She heard him, she went very still, the way a person goes still when they are caught in the middle of something private and painful, and he saw her try to gather herself, try to straighten her spine and compose her face, the same way she had composed her face at their wedding. That particular quiet dignity of a woman who does not want to need anyone. He sat down beside her. On the floor. On the cold stone floor of the chapel, in his good coat, in the pale morning light. He did not say anything. He did not put his arm around her or offer words that he had not earned the right to offer. He simply sat. Close enough that she could feel he was there. Close enough that she was not alone. For a long moment, she stayed very still. Then, slowly, Edmund reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. She did not pull away. She looked down at their joined hands for a moment, as if she were deciding something, and then she turned her face away from him and let out a long, shaking breath that she had clearly been holding for quite some time. They sat on the cold stone floor of the chapel and said nothing, and the small candle at the altar burned steadily, and outside the moor wind moved across the heather, and the morning came on slowly, grey and quiet, around them both. It was the first real thing that had passed between them. The first moment that was not managed or careful or contained behind glass. Edmund did not let go of her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but rough at the edges. She did not look at him. She said, "I am not usually like this." He said, after a moment, "I know." She turned to look at him then, surprised by that, surprised, he could tell, that he had paid enough attention to know anything about how she usually was. He looked back at her. He did not look away. He said, "I owe you an explanation." She waited. She did not push him. She simply waited, the way she had been waiting since the moment she arrived, with a patience that he understood now, for the first time, was not acceptance but endurance. She had been enduring him. And she had not complained, and she had not made him feel it, and that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, a very large thing. He said, her name was Maris. Eleanor looked at him. Her eyes were still wet at the edges, but her gaze was clear and direct and very steady. He said, "I loved her. When she died, I decided I would not put anyone else in that position. Not the position of being loved by me." He stopped. He looked at the candle. He said, "I thought I was protecting you." The silence held for a moment. Then Eleanor said, quietly, "You were protecting yourself." He did not argue with this. He sat with it, the way you sit with something that is true and uncomfortable and necessary. He sat with it, and he looked at the candle, and he did not let go of her hand. After a while, he said, "Yes. I suppose I was." She did not say anything more about it. She did not press him or correct him or try to draw more from him than he had offered. She simply nodded, slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and then she looked at the altar and they sat together in the chapel for another long stretch of silence that was, for the first time, not empty. It was something else. Edmund was not, by nature, a man given to sudden realizations. He came to things slowly, with reluctance, through the back way. But sitting there, on the cold floor, with Eleanor's cold hand in his and the candle burning quietly before them, he came to one. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about what protection meant, and he had been wrong about what he could afford to feel, and he had been wrong, most significantly, about Eleanor. She was not someone to be managed from a distance. She was not a quiet arrangement that required only his signature and his good name. She was a woman who walked the moors in the early morning and left books on tables and wept alone on chapel floors and did not ask him for a single thing, which was, he understood now, not strength so much as damage. She had learned to need nothing from people because people had taught her not to expect it. He had taught her, in 3 months, the same lesson. And he had done it so efficiently, so naturally, because he was very practiced at it. That knowledge settled in him like cold water. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he turned to look at her, and he said, "I would like, if you are willing, to do this differently." She looked at him. She searched his face with the careful attention of someone who has been misled before and has learned to look twice. Then she said, "How differently?" He said, "I do not know exactly. I have not done it before." There was a long pause. She said, "Neither have I." Something shifted between them in that moment, something unquantifiable, not dramatic, not the swift heat of sudden feeling, but something older and slower and, in its own way, more reliable. The thing that happens when two people who have been performing composure at each other finally stop performing and simply sit, cold and honest, in a quiet room together. Edmund helped her up off the floor. She was stiff from the cold stone. She brushed her coat straight with her free hand, and he did not yet release the other one. They stood in the candlelit chapel and looked at each other in the way they had not, in 3 months of marriage, looked at each other before. He said, "Let us go in." "You are cold." She said, "So are you." He said, "Yes." They walked back to the house together, across the frozen path through the private garden, past the stone wall where Maris's grave sat quiet in the morning light. Eleanor glanced at it briefly as they passed. Edmund did too. He did not stop. But he did not look away either. He held it. And he walked on. And he kept her hand in his all the way to the house. The morning after the chapel changed everything, but not in any way that was obvious from the outside. Ashvale Manor looked exactly the same. The stone was still grey, the corridors still long, the windows still narrow. Mrs. Hadley still moved through the halls with her quiet efficiency. The fires still burned low in the empty rooms. Everything that had been in place before was still in place, every physical arrangement, every piece of furniture, every habit of the house remained exactly as it was. But something beneath all of it had shifted, in the same way that the ground shifts before anything above it moves. A deep, tectonic thing. Quiet and irreversible. Edmund came to breakfast. Not as a performance, not with the rigid formality of the previous weeks, but simply and early, already seated when Eleanor came downstairs, with a pot of tea already poured and a second cup ready at her place. He was reading something at the table, a letter from the estate manager about repairs needed on the North Tenant cottages, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Good morning," in a voice that was not warm, exactly, but was present in a way it had not been before. He was there. Fully there, in the room, not behind glass. Eleanor sat down. She poured her tea. She did not say anything about the previous morning, and neither did he. They had, in the chapel, said what needed saying, and neither of them were people who spoke things twice. He said, after a moment, "The Northfield tenants have written about the roof on the eastern cottage. I am going to ride out this afternoon to look at it. You are welcome to come, if you like the ride." Eleanor held her teacup and looked at him steadily. She said, "I would like that." He nodded. He went back to his letter. She looked down at her tea and allowed herself, very briefly and privately, to feel the specific quality of relief that comes when something you have been hoping for, without permitting yourself to hope for it, turns out to be real. They rode out that afternoon. The moors in November were stripped and open, the heather gone brown, the sky low and the color of old pewter, and the horses moved well on the frozen ground. Edmund rode a large bay with a white stripe that he called nothing in her presence but that the groom called Griffin. Eleanor rode the grey mare she had been assigned at the start of her marriage, a steady and honest animal named Pearl that she had grown genuinely fond of. They rode side by side along the ridge path with the wind coming off the high ground, and Edmund talked to her, properly, for the first time. He talked about the estate, its history, its complications, the particular character of the tenants who had been there for generations. He was precise about it, specific in the way that only comes from genuine knowledge and care, and Eleanor listened and asked questions that showed she was following him and that she had, on her morning walks, already learned some things about the land that surprised him. He asked her once how she knew the name of a particular ridge, and she said she had spoken to the shepherd who kept his flock on the south field, an old man named George Lamb who had worked that ground for 40 years and who had been, she said, the most forthcoming person she had met since arriving at Ashvale. Edmund was quiet for a moment. Then he said, George Lamb does not usually speak to people he does not trust. Eleanor said, I brought him ginger biscuits. Edmund looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was unmistakably the architecture of one, the slight softening, the almost lift at the corner of his mouth. It was gone in a moment, but Eleanor saw it. She filed it carefully away. The cottage roof was in poor shape, a section of the eastern end had given way under the autumn rains and had been patched over with boards that would not survive the winter. Edmund spoke to the tenant, a careful and dignified man named Arthur Cole who had been farming the North Field for 23 years, and listened to him with a seriousness that told Eleanor this was not a landlord who had grown careless about the people his estate depended on. He asked Arthur specific questions about what had failed and when, and Arthur answered them, and Edmund made notes in a small book he kept in his coat pocket, and before they left he told Arthur that a stonemason would come within the fortnight. On the ride home, the light was going early, as it did in November, and the sky to the west had turned a deep and bruised shade of plum and copper. Eleanor watched it as they rode and did not speak for a while, and Edmund did not speak either, and the silence between them was, for the first time, an easy one. Not empty. Not careful. Just quiet. She said, eventually, you care about them. The tenants. He said, it is my responsibility. She said, that is not the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, no. It is not. He did not elaborate. He was not, she was learning, a man who elaborated. But the admission was real, and she accepted it for what it was. That evening, after supper, which was still largely quiet, but a different kind of quiet, Edmund paused in the hallway as they were going their separate ways and said, without looking at her, I should tell you about Maris properly. If you want to hear it. Eleanor looked at him. She said, when you're ready. He said, tomorrow, perhaps. She said, then tomorrow. He nodded. He went to his study. She went to her room. She sat by her fire and felt, for the first time in 3 months, that the house was not entirely opposing her. That it was, in its old and difficult way, beginning, perhaps, to open. The next morning, true to his word, he told her. They were in the library. Edmund stood by the window with his hands in his coat pockets and looked out at the frozen garden and told her about Maris Collier in the particular way that he did most things, not easily, not flowingly, but precisely. He did not embroider it or seek her sympathy. He said what had happened. He said when. He said where he had been and what he had seen and what had happened in the days that followed. He did not cry. He was not the kind of man who cried, or perhaps, Eleanor thought, the kind of man who did not permit himself to, which was a different thing. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment, still looking at the garden. Eleanor said, were you with her? At the end? He said, yes. She said, then she knew she was not alone. Edmund was silent for a long time. When he turned from the window, his face was composed, but something behind it was not, and Eleanor saw it and said nothing and let him be. Then she said, I should tell you something as well. He looked at her. She told him about her own family, her father's death, her mother's fear and its effects, the quiet pressure that had defined her adolescence. She told him that she had not come to Ashvale Manor in hope, only in necessity, and that she had made her peace with that before the carriage reached his gates. She told him that she had spent 3 months trying to be invisible because she had assumed, based on evidence, that invisibility was what he wanted. She said, I did not think I was allowed to take up space here. Edmund looked at her for a long time. Then he said, you are allowed. It was 2 words. But he said them with a directness and a weight that made them mean something considerably more than their simplicity suggested. Eleanor held his gaze and felt the 2 words land, and she did not say anything, because some things do not need a response. After that morning, things continued to shift. Slowly, Edmund was not a man for sudden transformations, and Eleanor was not a woman who trusted sudden things, but steadily, and in ways that accumulated. He began to walk with her in the mornings. Not every morning, not with any declared commitment, but often enough that it became expected. He knew the estate and the moorland thoroughly and showed her things she would not have found on her own, a small waterfall hidden in a fold of the low hills, a place where the heather had been growing continuously, the groom said, since before anyone could remember, a ruined mill on the far boundary of the property with a view across 4 counties on a clear day. He did not narrate these things with enthusiasm. He simply showed her, and she looked, and they walked back. She told him things too. She told him about the books she was reading and the letters she was writing to her sister, Lucy, who was the person in her family she most loved. He asked about Lucy, once, briefly, in the mild and careful way he asked things, and Eleanor told him that Lucy was 17 and clever and that she wanted to study natural history, which their mother thought was an entirely impractical ambition. Edmund said, with the slightest edge of dry precision, she might find the library here useful, in that case. Eleanor looked at him. She said, are you inviting my sister to stay? He said, I am suggesting the library is available. She smiled. She was not sure he saw it, because he had looked back at the path by then, but she smiled. She wrote to Lucy that evening and mentioned, as a matter of fact, that Ashvale's library was considerable and that an invitation might be coming. November ended. December came. The grounds went harder with frost, and the short days had a particular quality of cold light that Eleanor found, to her own surprise, beautiful. She was beginning to know the house. She was beginning to know its rhythms, its moods, the way certain corridors held the cold longer than others and the way the east parlor caught the late afternoon sun in winter for exactly 40 minutes before it gave way to gray. She was beginning to feel, tentatively, that she lived here. Not only that she occupied a portion of it, but that she actually lived here. That it was hers, in whatever imperfect way. And Edmund was still not easy. He was still private, still contained, still a man who held things close and gave them up reluctantly. He did not suddenly become warm. He did not begin to seek her company with anything that could be called eagerness. But he was honest, and he was present, and on 3 separate occasions in December he did something that she kept returning to with a quiet and private wonder. He came to find her. Not for anything urgent. Not for anything practical. Once, to show her a letter from the Natural History Society in York that he thought she might find interesting. Once, to ask whether she had eaten, because supper had been laid and it was growing cold. And once, the 3rd time, the one she kept coming back to most, simply to tell her that the sky to the north was doing something unusual, a quality of light that came rarely in winter, and that she might want to come and look before it passed. She went. She stood beside him at the north window and looked at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary, a long, slow streak of pale gold across the cloud bank, entirely out of place in December, like something from another season pressed briefly between the gray pages of this one. She said, I am glad you came to find me. He said nothing. But he stayed at the window beside her until the light faded. She did not push him further than that. She had learned, very well by now, the precise geography of Edmund Voss, where the doors were, where the walls were, and where, if you waited quietly and did not push, the walls were becoming, very slowly, something more like windows. The year was ending. The house was cold and still and exactly what it had always been. But Eleanor stood at the window in the December light and felt, for the first time since she had come to Ashvale Manor, that she was not only enduring. She was, in some small but genuine way, beginning to belong. December turned to January with the weight of a door finally closing on something that had been left too long open. The new year came quietly to Ashvale Manor, no celebrations, because Edmund did not mark the occasion, and Eleanor did not push for what he was not ready to offer. But there was a difference now. There had been a difference since the chapel, one that grew and changed in the days that followed, like a fire that has caught properly and is no longer in danger of going out. They were not husband and wife in any fully comfortable sense. The distance between them was still real, not hostile, not painful in the way it had been, but real. Edmund still rose early and worked long hours in his study. He still went days without easy words. He still had moments, Eleanor noticed, when he retreated to some interior room of himself and pulled the door closed, and she had learned not to knock on those moments, to let him find his own way back. But he always came back. That was the thing she held on to. He always came back. It was in January, on a morning when the frost was so heavy that the gardens looked carved from white stone, that she finally went to the east corridor. She had known the portrait was there. She had known it since her second week at Ashvale, when Mrs. Hadley had mentioned, in passing, that the east corridor was not generally in use and that the family preferred it undisturbed. Mrs. Hadley had said this without emphasis, which in Eleanor's experience meant it carried a great deal of emphasis indeed. She had not gone before. She had respected it the way she had respected the grave, as a wound that was not hers to touch without permission. But something had shifted in her understanding, after the chapel, after the conversations in the library and the rides across the moorland and the evening at the north window. She understood now that the locked things in this house were not kept locked to keep her out specifically. They were kept locked because Edmund had not known, for 7 years, what else to do with them. She went in the morning, when Edmund was at the far end of the estate meeting with the stonemason about Arthur Cole's cottage roof. She walked to the east corridor with steady feet. The corridor was dusty with disuse and cold, the way rooms get cold when they are not warmed by being lived in. There were several covered pieces along the walls, draped in white cloth, and at the far end, in the place of prominence, a large frame covered in dark fabric, not the same white cloth as the others but something heavier, more deliberate. Eleanor stood in front of it for a moment. Then she reached up and drew the cloth aside. The woman in the portrait was young. She had dark hair and pale skin and a quality in her expression that Eleanor recognized immediately, not as likeness to herself, they did not look much alike, but as something more complicated. She looked like someone who had been joyful. Not happy in a simple or easy way, but genuinely, profoundly joyful, the kind of joy that lives in the face even when the face is at rest. She looked like someone who had found the world entirely worth the trouble. Eleanor stood and looked at Maris Collier for a long time. She did not cry. But she felt something, a sorrow that was not hers, borrowed from the air of the room, and something else underneath it, something very like kinship. She thought, you were real. She thought, he loved you. She thought, you deserved to be seen. She replaced the cloth. She smoothed it carefully over the frame. She walked back down the east corridor and did not tell Edmund she had been there. She did not need to tell him. She simply carried it, the knowledge of Maris's face, the knowledge of her joy, and she carried it gently, with respect, the way you carry something that belongs to someone else but has been placed briefly in your care. That evening, she wrote to her mother, who had been pressing for a report of the marriage's progress in increasingly pointed letters. She did not tell her mother about the chapel, or the portrait, or the long silences of the first months. She wrote only that she was well, that the estate was beautiful in winter, and that she had begun, she thought, to understand her husband. Her mother wrote back promptly asking what precisely that meant in practical terms and whether he intended to spend the winter in Yorkshire or take a London house, because a London house would naturally offer advantages for Eleanor's younger sister. Eleanor set the letter down and felt, very clearly, why she had needed to leave her mother's house. In the kitchen, through the floor, she could hear Mrs. Hadley giving some gentle instruction to the kitchen maid. In the stable yard, which she could see from her writing desk window, the groom was leading Griffin in slow circles in the frost. The manner was its usual self-contained, old, a little severe, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone found it welcoming. But it was hers. Or it was becoming hers. Or she was becoming its, she was not sure which direction the belonging ran. Perhaps it ran both ways. Perhaps that was the nature of belonging. Edmund appeared in the doorway of her sitting room that evening, which was unusual. He knocked first, a single quiet knock, which she had come to understand as his way of asking whether she was available for company, without making the question so explicit that a refusal would require explanation. She said, "Come in." He came in. He stood in the middle of the room with the ease of a man who is not naturally at ease in sitting rooms but has decided to be there anyway. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "Geoffrey has written. My cousin. He will be in the county in 3 weeks and wishes to call. I want to make sure you are, that the visit is not unwelcome to you." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "You are asking if I mind a visitor." He said, "I am asking if you are ready for one." She understood the difference. He was not asking about hospitality. He was asking whether she felt settled enough, secure enough in her place here, to be put on display to his family without it costing her something. He was, in his sideways and oblique way, looking after her. She said, "I am ready." He nodded. He said, "Good. He will likely bring his wife, Clara. She is easy company. I think you will find her easy company." He said it the way he said things he was uncertain how to say, with extra precision, as if precision might carry the weight of the warmth he had not yet found the language for. Eleanor felt it land anyway. She said, "I look forward to meeting her." He nodded again. He looked at the fire for a moment longer. Then he said, "You went to the East Corridor today." Eleanor was still. She had not made any noise on the way there or back. Mrs. Hadley had not mentioned it, or at least she did not think so. She said, "Yes." He said, "I saw the cloth was shifted slightly. I straightened it." She said, "I am sorry if I." He said, "You do not need to apologize." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at the fire. He said, "What did you think of her?" Eleanor considered her answer with care. Then she said, "She looked like someone who loved being alive." Edmund was quiet for a very long time after that. Long enough that Eleanor thought he might not respond, and she had begun to adjust herself to the silence, when he said, very quietly, "She was." He said nothing more. He looked at the fire for a moment longer, and then he said good night, and he left. But in the doorway, for just a moment, he paused. He did not turn around. He simply stood there briefly, in the way of a man who is thinking about whether to say something more, and then does not say it, but does not move immediately either. Then he walked on. Eleanor sat by her fire for a long time after he was gone. She thought about the portrait. She thought about the grave with the heather. She thought about the chapel floor and his hand around hers, cold and real and unretracted. She thought, "You are getting to know him." She thought, "You are letting yourself." The month continued. Geoffrey arrived with his wife, Clara, who was exactly as Edmund had promised, easy company, warm and genuine and apparently unfrightened by her cousin's formidable quiet. She took to Eleanor at once and said so without embarrassment, and they spent 2 afternoons together in the east parlor talking with an ease that Eleanor had not felt with anyone since leaving her own home. Clara told stories about Edmund as a young man that he bore with dignified silence, and Eleanor listened and filed them away with great interest. Clara said, at one point, when Edmund had gone to find Geoffrey, who was looking at the Northfield plans, "You know, he used to laugh easily and often. He had a very good laugh." She said it without sadness, simply as a fact, the way you might describe a quality that was present in a person that others sometimes forgot to look for. Eleanor said, "I believe that." Clara looked at her. She said, "Good. That is exactly right. You should believe that." After Geoffrey and Clara left, the house returned to its usual quiet. But the quiet was different now. It had texture. It had history. There were meals with real conversation, slow and occasional and still somewhat formal in its way, but real. There were evenings in the library where they read separately but in the same room, and once Edmund read a passage aloud from something he was working through, not to perform it, but because the thought was good and worth saying, and Eleanor listened and said what she thought of it, and he considered her answer seriously. He was not easy. He was never going to be easy. But he was honest, and he was trying, and Eleanor, who had long since stopped expecting easy and had never been given to requiring it, found that she could live well in the space that honesty and trying made. It was on a Saturday evening in late January that the thing happened, the small, specific thing that Eleanor would come back to later, in memory, as the moment something in her finally understood itself. She had come downstairs late, unable to sleep, intending to find a book from the library. She went along the corridor and pushed open the library door and found the lamps already lit and Edmund there, but not reading. He was at the writing desk, and before him on the desk, open, was the natural history book. The one she had left on the table in the first weeks of their marriage, before the chapel, before any of this. He was looking at it. Not in the concentrated way he read things he was studying, but in the softer way of someone turning something over in his mind. The page he was on was the illustration of moorland heather, detailed and precise, the small bellflowers of it rendered in careful ink. He looked up when she came in. He did not seem alarmed or embarrassed. He said, "I could not sleep." She said, "Neither could I." She came into the room. She did not take a book. She sat in the chair near his desk, and he turned the book slightly so she could see the illustration if she wished. She looked at it. She said, "George Lamb told me that heather blooms late in a good year. That the color deepens in the cold." Edmund looked at the illustration. He said, "That is true." She said, "I should like to see it. In summer, when it blooms." He looked at her. He said, "You will." It was 2 words, the same as before. But this time they carried something different. They were not simply permission. They were promise. "You will. You will be here. You will still be here in summer, and I will be here with you, and we will see it together." Eleanor looked at him. He looked at her. Then she smiled, not the private, careful smile she had kept from him before, but a real one, open and unguarded, the kind she gave her sister. Something in Edmund's face changed. It was not a smile, he was not, yet, a man who arrived at smiles easily. But the set of his jaw softened, and his eyes held her gaze without retreating, and he looked, for one unguarded moment, like the man Clara had described. The one who had a very good laugh. Eleanor held the moment carefully. She did not reach for more than it offered. She simply let it be what it was. Then she said good night. She took her book. She went upstairs. She lay in her bed with the book on her chest and the fire burning low and listened to the house settle around her in its old way, and she thought, "I am not enduring anymore." She thought, "I am beginning to stay." Spring came to Ashvale Manor in the way it comes to high Yorkshire ground, not gently, not all at once, but in sudden and determined surges, a warm morning following a bitter night, green pushing up through the last of the frost with a kind of stubborn insistence that Eleanor found she respected enormously. She had been at Ashvale for 6 months. She knew this because she counted it on the morning of the first truly warm day, standing at her bedroom window with her second cup of tea and looking out at the garden where the early crocuses had appeared overnight, small and impossibly purple against the dark soil. 6 months. She had arrived in September as a stranger in someone else's life, and here she was in March, and the strange thing was that it was no longer someone else's. It was hers. The garden was hers. The library was hers, and the morning rides, and the conversation with Arthur Cole's wife at the North Cottage gate, and the particular quality of light that the East Parlour held for 40 minutes on clear winter afternoons. These things were hers not because they had been assigned to her, but because she had claimed them, quietly, without ceremony, by the simple and accumulative act of staying. Edmund was different in spring. Or perhaps she was simply better at reading him by spring. His rigidity did not vanish, it would never entirely vanish, she understood that now, and she did not want it to, because it was structural, part of what he was made of, the uprightness of him that she had come to find, unexpectedly, something she depended on. But he was lighter. Not visibly, not loudly. The change was interior, the way sunlight changes a room not by adding to it but by removing the gray that had been there before. He had begun, small thing by small thing, to touch her. Not in any way that was forward or presumptuous or in violation of the particular careful trust that existed between them. But he would place his hand briefly at her elbow when they were navigating a narrow doorway together. He would lean over her shoulder to look at something she was reading, close enough that she was aware of him. Once, on a morning ride, their horses had come side by side on the ridge path and his knee had briefly touched hers and he had not moved away. He had not moved away. Each of these things was small. But Eleanor collected them the way the dry ground collects rain, everything absorbed, nothing wasted. She had also, in March, received the letter from Lucy. Lucy's letter was long and detailed and breathlessly enthusiastic, because Lucy was 17 and the world had not yet taught her to contain her enthusiasm, which Eleanor considered one of her sister's finest qualities. She had been reading, she said, everything she could find about natural history, particularly botany, and she had been speaking to her schoolmistress, who had told her that there was, in fact, a women's college in London that offered a course in the natural sciences, and that the fees were significant but not impossible, and that if Eleanor could possibly, if it were not too much, if the Duke was at all. Eleanor folded the letter and went to find Edmund. She found him in the study, reading the estate accounts with the serious and methodical attention he brought to all things. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in and stood before his desk and said, "My sister Lucy would like to study natural history at a college in London. The fees are significant. I would like to help her if I can." Edmund looked up from his papers. He said, "What are the fees?" She told him. He nodded once, made a note in the small book by his elbow, and said, "I will write to the college next week to confirm the arrangement." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. She said, "You did not ask whether it was sensible." He said, "Your sister is intelligent and she knows what she wants. That is sensible enough." She said, "You have not met her." He said, "You have spoken of her often enough. That will do." Eleanor looked at him. He had returned to the accounts. But his mouth, she noticed, had something in it, not quite a smile, again, but the almost shape of one. The architecture of warmth that he had begun to permit himself, cautiously, in rare and specific moments. She said, "Thank you, Edmund." He said, without looking up, "There is no need." She said, "There is. Thank you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, still looking at the accounts, "You are welcome, Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her given name with that particular weight behind it, not as a placeholder, not as the correct form of address, but as something chosen. Something meant. She went back to her sitting room and wrote to Lucy and told her that the arrangement was being made and that she should prepare herself to go, and that she would be happy, and that happiness was worth every difficulty. Lucy wrote back in 48 hours, which was the fastest a letter had ever moved between Yorkshire and their mother's house, and said only, "Oh Ellie. I knew you would manage it." Eleanor had not thought of it as managing. She had simply asked. But then, she reflected, perhaps that was what managing looked like when you finally had somewhere solid enough to stand. April arrived. The heather on the South Hills was beginning its slow process of spring greening, the first new growth coming through the old dry stalks. The mornings were cold still but no longer bitter, and the light was returning to the sky in real and significant amounts, the 7 o'clock sky beginning to hold blue instead of gray, the late afternoons stretching out into long, pale gold. It was on an April morning, a Saturday, that Edmund asked her to come with him to the grave. He did not frame it as a request. He came to the breakfast room while she was still finishing her tea and said, "I am going to the private garden this morning. To the grave. I would like you to come, if you are willing." She set down her cup. She said, "I am willing." They went together, walking through the house to the garden door and then out along the path, the frost still crackling underfoot in the earliest light. The private garden was walled and quiet, the family graves in their old corner undisturbed, and at the far end, at the stone marker with its plain and careful lettering, Edmund stopped. He had brought heather. The fresh kind, early blooming, that he must have cut from the hillside that morning before she was awake. He crouched and placed it at the base of the stone, the way he had clearly done alone every week for years, with the ease and the grief of a ritual that had become as natural as breathing. Then he stood. He stood beside the grave and he was quiet for a time, and Eleanor stood beside him and was quiet too, and the morning came on around them, the birds beginning, the light brightening, the frost beginning to release its hold on the ground. Then Edmund said, not looking at her, "She would have liked you." Eleanor was still. He said, she liked people who were honest and who did not take nonsense from anyone. She liked people who walked. He said this with a care that told Eleanor he had thought about it. That he had turned it over and decided to say it, which for Edmund was always a significant thing. She said, quietly, "I would have liked her." He looked at the stone. He said, "Yes. I think you would have." They stood for another moment together. Then Edmund did something she had not expected. He reached out, not for her hand this time, but for her arm. He took hold of her arm, gently, the way you take someone's arm when you are walking on uneven ground, or when you want to be close to another person without quite having found the words for why. They stood like that for a while, at the grave, in the early spring morning. Then they walked back to the house for breakfast. The portrait was brought down from the east corridor in late April. Eleanor did not know that Edmund had arranged it until one morning she passed the east parlor and saw a man from the village on a ladder, hanging something on the wall above the fireplace. She stopped in the doorway. The cloth was off. Maris Collier looked out from the wall of the east parlor with her particular joyful quality, her dark hair and pale face and the expression that Eleanor had thought of many times since that January morning. She looked at the portrait. She looked at it for a long time. Mrs. Hadley appeared beside her and said, very quietly, in her careful way, "His Grace asked for it this morning. He said the east corridor was no place for a portrait." Eleanor said, "No. It isn't." She went about her morning. She did not say anything to Edmund about the portrait. But when he came to find her that evening, he had been coming to find her more often now, and she had stopped treating it as a surprise. He said, "The east parlor window frames have been resealed. I thought while the carpenter was here it was worth seeing to." She said, "Yes. And the portrait looks well there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It does." He sat down in the chair across from her, and she put down her book, and they talked for 2 hours, about the estate, about Lucy's college term beginning in September, about Geoffrey and Clara who were coming again in May, about a letter Edmund had received from a botanist in Edinburgh who had been corresponding with him about the moorland species of the North Field and who apparently wished to visit to collect specimens. Eleanor said, "I should like to meet him." Edmund said, "I thought you might. I told him you have been speaking with George Lamb about the South Field heather. He was interested." She said, "You told him about me?" He said, with absolute equanimity, "Of course." Of course. As if it were the most natural thing in the world that he should mention his wife to people he corresponded with. As if her existence were something he thought about, referred to, perhaps even found worth mentioning unprompted. Eleanor looked at her hands for a moment. She composed herself. She said, I am glad. He said, the heather should be in full color by July, if the spring continues mild. The botanist would like to visit then. She said, July is good. He said, yes. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said, quietly and directly, in the way he said the few significant things he chose to say, without decoration or approach, I am glad you are here, Eleanor. I am aware that the start of this was, I am aware that it was not what you deserved. I want you to know that I am aware of that. Eleanor did not say anything immediately. She held the words carefully, the way she held all the things he gave her, with both hands, with care, without rushing. Then she said, it is where I am. It is where I want to be now. That is enough. He said, is it? Truthfully? She said, truthfully. The beginning was difficult. But we are not in the beginning anymore. He said, no. He looked at the fire. Then he looked back at her. And then, slowly, with the specific deliberateness of a man who has thought about whether to do something and has decided, he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Not the desperate grip of the chapel floor. Not the instinctive reach of that first difficult morning. This was a choice. This was a man who had decided, clearly and without ambiguity, to choose her. To be present. To stay. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands. Then she looked up at him. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention she had noticed in him from the beginning, the deep, still focus of a man who did not look at things casually, who looked at them because they mattered. She turned her hand and held his back. Properly. Completely. He did not look away. Outside, the April evening was doing the thing that April evenings in Yorkshire sometimes do, turning from grey to something soft and almost warm, the light taking on a quality that belonged more to May than April, as if the season were briefly and generously ahead of itself. The garden beyond the window was green in a way that it had not been a month ago, the old walls holding the day's warmth, the early roses beginning their first unfurling. Somewhere on the South Hill, Eleanor knew, the heather was beginning its spring growth. By July, if the season was mild, it would be in full color, deep and extraordinary, the kind of color that had no business existing on moorland in the ordinary world and yet did, every year, with the stubborn and improbable grace of things that persist. She had been told she would see it. She believed that now. Not because Edmund had said it. Not only that. But because she was here, and she was real, and the house was hers, and he was not behind glass anymore. He was sitting beside her in the evening light with her hand in his, and he was choosing to be there, and she was choosing to let him, and choosing something, choosing anything, together, was everything that the beginning of their marriage had not been and everything that the rest of it, she understood now with complete clarity, was going to be. She did not need it to be easy. She had never needed easy. She needed it to be real. It was. The candle on the side table burned low. The fire in the grate held steady. Edmund did not move his hand from hers and she did not move hers from his, and the room was warm, and outside the moorland evening settled into the deep and quiet blue of an April night, and Ashvale Manor, that great grey and difficult house that had swallowed her whole on the first day and given nothing back for months, breathed around them both like something old and finally, at last, at rest. Edmund said, after a long while, in a voice so low it was nearly just thought, I put the heather there every week because I did not know what else to do for her. Because I had not been able to do anything when it mattered. Eleanor said, you are here every week. That is not nothing. He was quiet. She said, she is not forgotten. That is not nothing either. He turned to look at her. His face, in the low light, was the face she was learning, the one behind the composed surface, the real one, the one that carried 7 years of careful grief and was beginning, slowly and on its own terms, to carry something else alongside it. He said, "No. She is not forgotten." He said, "And I am here." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "Yes. You are." And that was all that needed to be said. He was here. She was here. The house was real, and the spring was real, and the heather would be real in July, and all of it, the difficult beginning, the long silences, the chapel floor, the portrait, the grave, the gradual and imperfect and entirely genuine opening of one person to another, all of it had been real too. Real was enough. Real was, in fact, everything.